Hello. Hey, it's cold in here. Right? Nice to meet everybody. Scott Potteiger here from NNIT, joined by
Dennis
my
Even.
better-looking counterpart.
Yeah. So I lead up our supply chain practices, which includes serialization. Been with NNIT now for about 3 years now, Scott, right?
Yep.
Known Scott and company there for longer than that. I was Pfizer for 23 years, led their global serialization program, and doing all kinds of fun stuff with many different people like yourselves and your company. So it's good stuff nowadays.
Yeah, we appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk with you guys. Want to take a minute to talk about what makes us qualified to be up here, right? Why are we experts in this space? Clearly, Dennis is way more of an expert than I am, right? But I'm going to be here to facilitate the discussion and talk about kind of who we are as a company. Not going to go through this slide in detail, but just to point out a couple of the key highlights. One, it says 280 plus strategies and health checks, right? We've made a living, before the regulation came into play, we were doing strategies on how to become compliant. Now that different phases of the regulation and DSCSA have come into play, we're doing health checks or gap analysis of, are you compliant? Are you operationally efficient? Are you getting ready to add value, right? And there's a whole bunch of lessons learned when we come with the corresponding implementations and remediations. The other aspect is Service Bureau, right? It's managed services for a lot of our manufacturing and wholesaler and dispenser customers, right, who don't have full-time serialization resources. And through that, right, we get a lot of exposure into these day-to-day scenarios and situations like exceptions. So we've been doing this for a long time. Before DSCSA was DSCSA, back in the Florida and California e-pedigree days. And we've been partners with TraceLink since day one, and that's why they asked us, I think, to speak about exceptions today.
All right.
You want to jump to the next one? All right. The slide is an eye chart, right? But it's just meant to be a backdrop for a little perspective. Last time I was on the FutureLink stage was May of 2023. And the topic was, I was specifically talking about all the health check work that we've done and what our common, like the most common themes were. Similar to today's topic, today's specific to exceptions, right? But it was kind of funny because when I remember saying, hey, we're exactly 178 days from interoperability or whatever it was, because it was May 23 and we were getting ready for November. Right? And everyone was panicked and exceptions was a big deal. And then we all know the FDA kicked the can twice actually, right? And more or less delayed the regulation by 18 months. So back then, the biggest topic was exceptions or the biggest gap. And I'd say even more so now, but the good news is the industry's put a lot of work in between now and then to the point where, yes, it's still the biggest concern, but there's a lot of, we're way better off than we were. So, I'm going to start with the real basics. What is a compliance exception? Everybody may define that a little bit different depending on your risk tolerance. I'm going to ask Dennis, based on a lot of these health checks, because he leads a lot of these where we do these exception strategies with our customers. What is a compliance exception? What are the key considerations when defining a compliance exception and some of the underlying root causes that could cause them?
Yeah, so if you look at the slide up there, you see the upper left-hand corner depicts a predominant definition of an exception, right? And you see left and right-hand side being compliance versus a risk register or internal and external exceptions. When we look at this, typically the predominant exception is that mismatch between the data and the physical product, right? That's not the only ones out there. Again, depending on how you define it, you could have master data alignment issues, you could have other, even technically a negative verification could be considered. Depends on how your definition is. But what we try to do with our clients is make sure they understand the risks and the aspects towards that. So on the right-hand side, those are the traditional ones. Those are the ones that you're seeing, like where HDA did between the manufacturer and the wholesaler community. Those are the ones that the FDA is looking at very explicitly, that you need to do those. It's out of compliance if you don't resolve that, right? Internally, you're going to have a lot of other ones, whether it's for intercompany sales or movements of the goods internally, and maybe there's exceptions in there as well. Not necessarily directly a compliance issue. However, some of those things can lead to compliance or maybe even Another problem is a supply risk, which starts impacting revenues, et cetera. So it's really important to understand what an exception is in your definition and how you're resolving it and going forward with it. Some of the key things when we do that, though, is the stated obvious of someone will come to you and say, hey, I have a product no data situation. Well, not necessarily. Maybe it is the reverse. It depends on the vantage point. So it's important to really make sure that you don't take for granted what people tell you, and that you actually go through and make sure you do the right analysis and collaborations to figure out what it is, get through that incident, the incident of the exception, and identifying what the actual cause of it is from an incident perspective, and then longer term even, what would actually maybe be the actual root cause of the actual problem that caused it to begin with. So.
Okay, so kind of building on that, right? The initial deadline for this was November of 23, and the FDA delayed it. We know because there were varying degrees of readiness across the supply chain. So they framed that not as a delay, right? They framed it as this stabilization period. So matter of opinion, are we more stable now?
We're definitely more stable. We're not fully stable, that's for sure, and we're not going to be yet. Some of the comments came out on the prior stage with Natasha and Brian. We've been peeling the onion, right? So if you think about it, we started off early on, it was technical connectivity challenges and things of that nature. Then you got your master data issues and stuff like that. We're really getting to the point now, and not the whole industry yet, is actually scanning and using that data as far as the product and the compliance goes forward. Therefore, there's a lot of hidden issues on the data to physical matching. And those are the things that are going to start coming out more and more as our industry ramps up on that scanning. So it's an unknown. We saw similar things in Europe back in the day, but that was really a big bang theory because it turned on those e-alerts all in one shot. This is a little bit different. It's been going slowly up and then resolve some of the stuff. And but this next one, this will definitely have an impact as the industry starts scanning and really truly compares the product to the data. The other thing of this thing that's been a challenge and has gone on over the last, two and a half years, whatever it's been, was the way we contact and collaborate with the people is very interesting. It started very rudimentary, everybody doing their own thing, some not doing anything, some people just throwing out emails out there and saying, Scott, you take care of this, there's an issue. So it's really been a hodgepodge to date, but what you're seeing is it's slowly increasing and getting better as we converge on better ways to collaborate and communicate on this.
So we're not stable yet, but definitely better off than we were. I think we can agree on that. As we work through a lot of these different exception scenarios, we continue to uncover unknowns, right? And we're kind of stumbling through those individually, like within the four walls of our respective companies, and then also as an industry, HDA, PDG, GS1, right? So through this process, what are some of the unknowns or the most common unknowns or the most common issues that you've encountered during the stabilization period that you couldn't have foreseen back 18 months ago when I was up on stage saying, hey, you got to be ready for exceptions by November?
Yeah, I think the three biggest ones I can think of is, number one is that false sense of security. People think the fact that their data is being sent out there and people are receiving it into their systems, that they think it's accurate. But the question is it accurate to the physical product? So that's a huge unknown that we just talked about a couple seconds ago. That's, to me, the biggest one right now. And whether people really do understand or not, their product is physically accurate to the data, right? That's the big question. That's going to be the big one that's going to bite us. There's also, in that same light, and some of the things that we're seeing, you talked to a lot of the wholesalers and stuff like that, like Scott Mooney, et cetera, McKesson, et cetera. They're seeing where there's base aggregation issues in the actual G10 cases, right, that are coming from the manufacturer. They're getting them back as exceptions from the pharmacies or further down wholesalers that they're selling to. So you're seeing multi-levels of exception handling that have to be dealt with, which, again, our industry is not fully ready for that, to be able to handle those things. So we're getting used to it. We're building those processes. The last big one right now that's going on, there's a lot of talk on it. In fact, there's one tomorrow and the next day, some of these things. So it's those non-standard shipping practices, right? So GS1's holding a event on the whole 340B aspects and like that, or drop shipments. We have a lot of times where we have different title models or flash sales and things like that. There's a lot of these different ways and models that people distribute and manage product and the ownership of these products. That, again, it's not that standard massive happy path where we just standard sell from a manufacturer to wholesaler to the dispenser. So it's those oddities and the non-standard shipping stuff, I think, is a big unknown that people are still, and as an industry, we are still engaging and working through.
Right, and that's the tricky part, right? Is we have these issues, we have these challenges, but it's kind of the catch-22. The industry as a whole isn't ready because a lot of times, you might be able to fix it within your four walls, but it needs to be a bigger fix, outside your four walls, the collaboration with your supply chain partners, right? So in reality, a lot of the work that's been done to date has been more Band-Aids than it has been long-term solutions. You want to talk through a couple, what you'd probably consider the most common Band-Aids?
Yeah, I mean, the way the industry has gotten by till now, you mentioned the stabilization periods. Bottom line is the WEEZ, the exemptions, the stabilization periods has been the biggest Band-Aid that the industry has used. Not everybody, we've still moved that product in the supply chain, but we haven't fully addressed everything yet. We don't know the full data qualities, things of that nature. So that's been the predominant Band-Aid that people have used to date at this point in time. Again, lacks of, when we started and it's different now than it was 2 years ago, and it's getting better. It's just a lack of tools and processes to go through these things in a manageable state, being able to document them properly, have the right tools to understand what the problems are, what questions to ask, how to exchange the information between you and your collaborative partner where you have the exception. So that's a lot of the things that people have just been doing is dealing with ad hoc or just ad-libbed process to deal with these things. That's going to be a challenge if your numbers go way up and whether you're going to be able to hold to the capacities and get that product resolved and moving in the times that the industry wants them to move. It'll be a challenge. I mean, you see in the bottom right of the screen down there, right, you see where it says 10 days. We know the 10 days to treat a suspect product, that's fine. Initially the industry was like about 3 days we can hold the products, but I can tell you this. You talk to the wholesale network, they don't have the space to hold that product. They're going to be pushing really fast, really hard to get that down, that resolution into hours. And by the way, they mean hours. So if you're getting a delivery that went out Friday and got to them in the middle of the night at 2 a.m. or something like that, those guys are going to expect to be resolving that within the next few hours. They're not going to wait till Monday. They're not going to wait till Saturday morning. So there's a lot of evolution on that to deal with. So the last thing I would talk about is, and this one's we're not even here on this one yet, it's the whole correction mechanism. And how do you actually, once you understand what the problem is, how do you technically correct some of these things? Great, if you just have extra product, you can ship it back. Okay, that's not technical, let's just physically ship it back. But how do you technically correct my EPCS to match your EPCS on the ownership and the transaction we had? If there's errors, we don't have standardized correction mechanisms. There's been some talked about in the industry, like there was the whole error declaration notion at one point in time, right? That's gone away. We're really in a manual state to do that technical correction right now, and every individual system is going to be a little bit different because we all have different systems and solutions. That's going to be another challenge, I guess, how you do that, and that's something that people have to gear up for and be ready for to deal with. We're probably a year or two away from figuring out how to deal with that properly, at best.
Yeah. So at some point, we absolutely are going to have to rip off the Band-Aid, right? Or multiple Band-Aids. Natasha and Brian actually said it best, is what we're doing today going to work tomorrow? And I think the answer in a lot of scenarios is no, right? Or at least that's where we should be focusing our energy, is on those issues where the answer to that is no. So, what do some of those long-term solutions look like for manufacturers in May, wholesalers in August, and then dispensers, larger dispensers in November, and then the smaller dispensers out into 2026?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a great thing about the stabilization period is it's been the lessons learned. And again, you can see the evolution of the industry on a holistic basis that we're applying a lot of these lessons learned, some of the things that we talked about with the other slide up there. So some of the unique challenges and some of the things of what people need to start applying is really to watch out for any assumptions in the process, right? So again, you get a communication from somebody that you have an exception. Don't just take their word for it. Make sure you prove it. In fact, before you ever notify someone else of an exception, prove it to yourself. Don't make assumptions on this. So knowing that scenario, those scenarios that you're talking, the product no data, data no products, and the other ones that are out there, make sure you have that accurate. Get down to what the actual incident cause is, not just what you're hearing someone verbally tell you, right? Get that alignment. Know what that is, okay? One of the other unique challenges is how do you go about, and what we coin, you can see in the bottom right of the slide here, you see a diagnostic matrix and then remediation. So we have a whole process that we put together that we work with our clients and delivering the solutions and on handling exception handlings. It's a whole diagnostic matrix. It's a method and it's a way to get through and understand specifically what the challenge is, what the actual cause of that is. And then once you understand what the cause of it is, right, what is the incident cause, then you can go and say, okay, now I can fix it. And then there's a whole process and different steps and how to go about correcting that in alignment with your partner. So it's really important to have, a methodology, the right people that can do this. Often if you're still in a project-based mode, you're using your experts to do that. But there's only a couple experts in, say, your company, depending on the size of your company. That may not be enough to handle the volume. So how do you scale that up, right? And that's where some of these tools and processes come to play to make sure you can do that properly and consistently. The other unique challenge is that collaboration. Guess what? If I'm selling out to potentially everyone in this group, if I'm manufacturing, guess what? My partnership there with Aurobindo or with someone else out there, we all have different solutions and systems in place, and we all have different policies, we all have different processes in how we handle exceptions. You got to find that commonality between you and that particular partner, collaborator for that incident to figure out how you're going to analyze to resolve this. Because we all, again, have our own different ways of working, our different policies, again, goes back to different systems. So it's a definitely unique challenge to figure out how to go about that. And I mentioned it before in the prior slide. The other unique challenge still is that still sits out there and it's going to loom out there for a while, is that actual technical correction mechanism. Don't be surprised, it's going to be out there. How do you go about in correcting these things when they happen? It's not necessarily easy. One of the biggest ones that we like when we talk to our customers and work them through these processes, many manufacturers say we don't take returns, right? Many of us, no, we don't take returns. Okay, I get it. However, what happens when you have a pallet or maybe some product that didn't make it out on the shipment and it got left behind? Now, it's still sitting on your physical dock, never left your possession, but by the way, in your EPCIS and your inventory system, you just said you sold it to wholesaler X, right? How do you get that back into your system? So you can either do it manually, or what we coin and we say is you can use a non-standard or a virtual return, right? There's different ways to do this thing. So it's really identifying some of the unique challenges that serialization puts on us and figuring out how you're going to correct some of these things that keeps everything aligned, your inventory, your finances, and your compliance.
Yeah, so we spent a lot of time talking about the problem being exceptions, right? And kind of the challenging part in and of itself here is that an exception can be so many different things, and the definition of an exception is different from company to company. But the one thing we're definitely aligned on, the answer is a combination of processes, systems, and documentation, right? So regardless of what you're going to do, it's never going to be a one size fits all. It's more complex than that, right? So when we go through our engagements, for people that are getting out ahead of this, that have been working on this since the stabilization period, we call these playbooks, right? We're helping them put together a right-sized playbook based on what their role is within the supply chain. Gets super complicated when you're working with somebody that has multiple hats, right? You have someone that is a manufacturer and a CDMO, right? Or you have someone that's a wholesaler but also has 3PL capabilities. Like there's a lot of different use cases that you have to account for. But from a buy-in perspective, when you're working, you've been involved over the past 12 months, I'd say, with at least 20 different exception strategies, if not more, and different pressure test scenarios and things like that. Like what are some of the bigger challenges? And the business sponsor you're talking to, they're normally aligned, right? They see this as an issue, right? But where do you struggle, or what are your recommendations to others that are in the crowd, maybe that are trying to get buy-in from other stakeholders within the organization to realize that, hey, this is as big as I'm saying it is, right? Whereas they're probably just saying, come November or finally now May, we're done, right? Serialization is finished.
Yeah. Well, upper left-hand corner there, Scott, right? That tells a picture of what you're talking about there, right? It's a journey. Because as all serialization's been a journey. Exception handling has got its journey. In that awareness, you can see awareness is strategy. Scott mentioned playbook. We'll talk about that, to the actual implementation and sustainability, right? So awareness is that first one, Scott, to answer that first part of the question is you got to make sure people really understand the problem at hand. And they don't necessarily. People really often think that because it's serialization, it's data, they think, oh, it's automatically a data issue. Well, not necessarily. It can be the physical issue. It could be other issues and things of that nature. So going through or defining what is an exception, understand what are the different pieces of the puzzle to put this in play, how to handle them, what resourcing, all that. There's a lot of different pieces of the puzzle that go to play to make this happen. And again, it varies for every company too. Different size companies, different virtual versus physical manufacturers versus wholesalers. We all have different challenges based on our demographics of our company and the size and scale, who we sell to and how we sell to.
And the risk tolerance, right? That's a big factor too. It goes back to like computer systems validation, not related to exceptions, right? But every company has a different risk level, acceptable
100%.
level of risk when it comes to projects like this. And do they want to dot every I and cross every T, right? Or do they just want to make sure that you can read what I'm writing type thing?
100%. And that goes back to that definition, as you talk about. So in the processes that we guide people on, there's a compliance level risk, there's a high level risk, and then we go to a low risk. Right? We skip right down to it. And compliance is directly that. It's one that really the FDA is looking. This is part of the law. If you don't do this, if you don't correct this incident, you're literally out of compliance to exchange that product. Right? That's that. The high risk are those ones. Again, those are the ones that could lead you into a compliance risk, or is going to lead you into potentially a supply disruption, revenue disruption, et cetera, right? And then the low ones are usually typically more in the best practices, efficiency, some of the smaller things you do in the background of your systems and solutions and processes. But yeah, that risk is a big tolerance question, and it varies by every customer, that's for sure.
Yep. Ultimate goal, right? At the end of the day, we're trying to make sure something like this should never interrupt business operations, right? And that's always been everyone's biggest complaint with serialization in general, right? Initially it was the manufacturers when they had to, rework all their lines, and then the wholesalers, right? When, just from a DC operational perspective. Well, now here's another threat. It's kind of like, hey, you're in the red zone getting ready to score, but now all of a sudden, oh no, we got to figure out exceptions, right? And what I mean by that is, how do we handle exceptions in a way where it's not going to interrupt business operations? You need to have an approach. There's no perfect approach. There's no perfect system out there, right? It's that making sure, and by an approach, we call it a playbook. That's a fancy marketing term, right? But it's a combination of those systems, processes, documentations, right? So I know you've built a lot of these playbooks. What are the most common themes that you see, right? Not talking any specific, like, could you use Poet to orchestrate things? Sure. There are systems out there. They're not a one-size-fits-all system. Although TraceLink probably wants me to say that there is, but there's lots, right? But that's with any problem. But the idea is, from an approach perspective, right? What are the most common themes that you see out there?
Yeah, I mean, the key components when we work with the clients are, again, first of all, is have that approach, have that strategy that you see out there, right? Have a method, a direction that you're taking this in to be able to put things in compliance, put this into compliance. But then what are the key components of that? So before we even get into the exception, the first thing we preach, first of all, is avoidance. There are things that people can do to ensure their data accuracies and things of that nature, just try and even just avoid the issues to begin with. You can't get rid of them because it's your, not just you, it's the other side of the fence as well, but avoidance is a big one. What is your process to handle these incidents? Is there also an overarching process to monitor the bigger picture to make sure things aren't going stale, make sure things are being managed, having the right people in place to manage and oversee the processes and execute the processes? The tools you heard us talk about. You see a little picture of parts of it there on the bottom right, some of the diagnostic matrix stuff. What tools and processes do you need to put in place to deal with diagnosing to correction? How about recording these things? We're talking about GXP type data here, right? Recording these things depending on the risk level of that client and of that particular incident. Where and how are you recording? Are you using a ticketing system? Are you doing it some other way or shape or form, right? Making sure you get that. How about the sustainability? Who's going to run and operate this thing, by the way, with the varying degrees potentially of
That's a big one.
Right.
And the change management associated with it. Right?
Exactly.
It's changing people's day-to-day operations, especially those people in a DC or warehouse in that environment.
And there's going to be an evolution. We're going to see, as people start scanning more, you're going to see a ramp up. And then as we start figuring these out and resolving these more as an issue, it's going to come down, right? But then what's going to happen is, say, the wholesale community and the people downstream are going to say, well, I need it faster. So now you got to have more coverage at different hours of the time. There's going to be a lot of different gyrations. Your resourcing, your sustainability, and how you have to manage this is going to go up and down. And how do you have a model to support that? And that's not easy. Like you say, the change management of that, whether it's just getting people on and off, how do you do that? Do you have temporary resources? Do you have other resources you can borrow? But there's training of it. It's not easy. And the last one that I would say in this space, and you see it's called P&P impacts, it's process and procedures. There's a lot of existential impacts to your existing policies and procedures when you talk about serialization in whole, but even specifically exception handling. So when you start correcting these things, what are your policies on some of these things to be able to do so? So you have a damage, right? We've had damages forever. But do your correction mechanisms of correcting and how you handle a damage also include now what you do with the serialization aspects, as an example? What do you do? You heard me talk about that virtual return scenario. What you do there, you've had returns forever from clients, but now how do you handle the serialization aspect? So it's really about understanding the impacts of exceptions as a smaller piece of the whole DSCSA, and how do these process and procedures, as you try and go about correcting these things, to do that. And you can see a list of the predominant ones that we work with the clients on. There are other ones at times because everyone has a little bit different structures of the policy procedures, but these are very common stated, is understanding the gap analysis of that, and then making sure those get updated so the people that are going to operate and run these things know how to do it. Just I guess in closing, I would say a couple things. Again, it's a journey. You see it's a path to exception. It's a journey through this. Understand where you're at. Also understand where the industry at, and that's probably where I'm going to leave you, is to me, there's 3 stages that I see in the exception handling and DSCSA and these other things. Certainly exception handling. The first thing is manual. We're working in a very manual mode right now, manhandling tickets as they come and exceptions as they come and all the above. The next stage, and these are some of the things that Scott was mentioning certainly with TraceLink, with their POET and stuff like that, is how do we start automating some of the handling, make that manual handling a little bit easier for us so we don't have to put so much effort into it, right? So process and procedures start automating, making that handling easier. And the last phase of the game, and this is the one that's out there, is how do we start getting closer to that auto correction? So those more common correction mechanisms make the correcting actually easier. Again, that's that furthest out. So I'd say we're still in the tail end of the manual / at the beginning end of the handling more, starting to handle more in a more automated way, taking some of the resource out of it. But we're not there. We won't get there really until we get this thing fully enacted. And that's going to push us over the edge because people's going to need to get their resource back to do other more valuable things.
I agree. I hope I'm not up here next year talking about exceptions and the fact that the deadline's another 6 months down the road. I don't think there's any more enforcement discretion coming, but in reality, next year at this time, there's still going to be a ton of lessons learned, and it will be far from finished, right? But it will be way more stable. We'll have way more of a new normal, if you will, right? And we'll continue to adapt as an industry.
There you go.
That's our story. We're sticking to it.
Thank you much. We appreciate your time.